Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302. And today the topic that we'll be covering is that of World War I. Now, when we were in class last time, we began our discussion over the American Progressive Era. And we saw that there was a lot of reforms that would be pushed through during that period. However, we'll see that period will become almost incomplete, mainly because America is going to be distracted by something else, i.e. the outbreak of the First World War. Now, to understand the First World War and what's going to occur within this conflict, we need to, for just a moment, turn this from an American history class to a European history class to understand what was occurring over in Europe in 1914. Now, Europe by 1914, it becomes a continent of rivals. It was not the same continent of nations that we see today. There's not a lot of little nations, but rather there were large empires. You had nations like the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and several others. In each one of these empires, during the imperialistic age, they were very competitive in trying to construct larger and larger empires. However, eventually through these rivalries, we will see the outbreak of conflict. Because just as an analogy, you can't have two bullies on the same block without them fighting. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, tensions would become especially high, especially out in a region known as the Balkans. And eventually we'll see that a small conflict that originates in the Balkans regions of Europe is going to explode and impact the rest of Europe. Now, it's also going to contribute to the outbreak of World War I, and why we'll see all these empires fight against one another was because of the alliance system that was also in place at this moment. So the alliance system that was in place in Europe at the outbreak of World War I, it was nothing new. And I do want to point out, while the alliance system is a big reason to why we'll see many of these powers get involved in this conflict, alliances were nothing new to the period. We could literally have seen alliances all throughout history. Now, there were two major alliances by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century. The first would be that of the Triple Alliance, which would be Germany, Austro-Hungary, as well as Italy. And the other major alliance would be that of the Triple Entente. Now, the Triple Entente would include the powers of France, Great Britain, as well as Russia, and basically what both of these alliances are going to agree on is if one nation of that alliance is attacked, then the others would go off to war against whoever had attacked them. And because we see that most of these European empires were a part of an alliance, this is going to lead to a domino effect when we do start to see some of these empires go off to war with one another. Now, with these alliances in place, what will eventually cause the outbreak of World War I will be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, many people are familiar with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but basically who Franz Ferdinand was, he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And prior to the outbreak of World War I in 1908, Austria-Hungary is going to annex into their empire the region of Bosnia. However, many of the people of Bosnia did not want this, and there was a lot of hostilities in that region as a result. Now, to go on a goodwill tour to hopefully promote some sort of, not nationalism, but hopefully to promote some sort of unity to ease tensions, Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is going to go on this goodwill tour of Bosnia. And this is where on June 28th, 1914, he's going to be assassinated in the town of Sarajevo. Now, who is he assassinated by? Well, he's assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, who was a member of an organization known as the Black Hand, but they were associated with the Serbian government. Over the course of the next month, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to basically conduct an investigation, and after this month-long investigation, they determined that the Serbians, rightfully so, were behind this assassination. And as a result, they will declare war against Serbia, effectively beginning another war in the Balkans. However, this is going to explode because Serbia, before Austro-Hungary can declare war on them, they're going to have a major ally. Russia had agreed with Serbia that if Austro-Hungary were to attack them, then they would declare war against Austro-Hungary. Now, when this happens, we'll see that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is also going to have a major ally. Remember that alliance they had with Germany? Well, they would establish an alliance through their alliance with Germany. Germany would declare war on Russia if they attack Austro-Hungary. And then from here, if Germany were to declare war on Russia, Russia is going to have a major ally with France, who would then declare war on Germany once this takes place. And as you can see, it leads to this domino effect to where by August of 1914, almost all of Europe has declared war against some power. Now, with this said, most of those who would go off to war in this early month of August of 1914, they were enthusiastic when going off to war. However, they will come to confront what we now call modern warfare, because we will see that World War I would prove to be an extremely destructive conflict, especially as we start to see soldiers, as they go out to the front, begin to be bogged down in what's known as trench warfare. Now, by the beginning of 1914, warfare itself has changed a great lot, especially over the course of the next 50 years. Because what's going to make World War I so deadly is the fact that we'll see the industrialization that had impacted not only the American economy, but several other nations' economies. It's also going to impact weaponry, as well as technology that we'll see used throughout World War I. Most notably, we'll start to see that killing will become industrialized, because you'll see the invention of machine guns as well as bolt-action rifles, which fire a lot more rounds a minute compared to the muskets of the 19th century. However, even though we see the introductions of these new weapons, we'll see that the tactics that have been in the 19th century, where people march shoulder to shoulder as if they're out on parade going into battle, it hasn't changed a whole lot. And as a result of this, since the tactics were so behind the times, we'll see whenever these armies confront one another with these new industrial weapons, it's going to spell disaster, especially when we start to see both armies begin to dig in. Now, immediately as both of these armies attack one another early on in the earlier portions of the war just outside of Paris in France, they will begin to dig into the earth, because the best way to avoid getting shot is to have some sort of cover. And this is where they would construct ditches that would ultimately become known as trenches. Now, trenches are nothing new to warfare. We actually see them used all throughout human history, even most notably going back to the Roman Empire, but they will become especially noteworthy during World War I, because we'll see with the trench system providing this cover, with the introduction of machine guns and also the introduction of barbed wire to where you can control where people go in front of your trenches and block their pathway, this is going to make killing industrialized. We'll see that the battlefield deaths in World War I are going to be extremely high. At places like the Battle of the Somme as well as the Battle of Verdun, you would see in just a mere few hours, tens of thousands of soldiers would be killed. In the case of the Battle of Verdun, where it would take place over the course of almost a year, you'd see over 1 million battlefield deaths would occur in that singular battle. And what are they going to gain from this? Well, typically what we had seen with previous conflicts, a lot of territory would be gained. However, in the case of the trench system, we'll see, especially out on the Western Front, tens of thousands of individuals are going to die for mere yards of ground. Now, just to put it into perspective, one of the more famous battles of the First World War, that of the Battle of the Somme, on the first day of the battle, the British are going to launch an attack against the German army. And on July 1st, 1916, of the 120 soldiers who would go over the top, go over their trench to attack the Germans, over 60,000 of them, almost half of them, are going to be either killed or wounded. 20,000 of them killed. And what are they going to gain at the end of that day? Well, in many cases, nothing. If they were lucky, perhaps just a few hundred yards of land. And quite literally, the First World War will be a war of inches. And we will continue to see that battle after battle, casualties would remain relatively high. But as these casualties remain relatively high during this portion of the conflict, we will see that America is going to be relatively untouched. Because as we talked about the outbreak of World War I, you may have noted that I didn't mention America getting involved in this conflict. Because while all these nations were going off to the war in 1914, America effectively is going to stay on the sideline, trying to remain neutral during the course of this conflict. Now, as war breaks out in Europe in the late summer of 1914, America is going to remain neutral, even when both powers kind of, in some aspects, try to get America involved in the war. Now, the reason for this is Woodrow Wilson at first is going to oppose getting involved in the conflict. Obviously, as we'd already seen through the trench warfare system, Americans are going to be horrified by seeing these long casualty lists associated with those various battles that I mentioned a moment ago. And many Americans will view this as Europe's problem. And if they were to get involved in the war, what would they be fighting for? Many Americans viewed they would be fighting for European ends. And as a result, most Americans are going to oppose getting involved in the conflict very early on. And we'll see that Woodrow Wilson would also stomp out any sort of efforts by some of his rivals to try to bring America into the war. However, it will be very difficult to keep America out of the war, because we will see there will be several American casualties, especially amongst American civilians, on the high seas. Now, ever since the beginning of the conflict, as soon as Great Britain gets involved in the war, we will see that the British are going to employ a naval blockade of the German coast. The reason for this was so that way, hopefully, they would starve out within a couple of years, bringing about an end to the war. Now, the German Navy was nowhere near as powerful as the British, and so if the Germans were to counter this and try to employ their own blockade against Great Britain, they had to employ submarines. They would use their infamous U-boats, which would begin to target military convoys as well as military ships. But it wasn't long after the beginning of the war that we also start to see that German ships begin to target civilian vessels, mainly cruise liners, which were being used by the British and the Allied powers to transport supplies to Great Britain or into France. Now, this is where we start to see the formation of a policy known as unrestricted submarine warfare, which I'll go into here more in just a second. And it would proclaim that certain portions of the Atlantic would be known as a war zone. And any ship that was found in that war zone, it could be fired upon by the German U-boats. And as a result, to no surprise, we'll see several cruise liners are going to be sunk and thousands of civilians are going to be killed. Now, with that said, the most infamous episode that would occur with this that would almost bring America into war and start to promote war fever in the U.S. would be the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania will take place in May of 1915. However, it's not going to bring America into war. Now, over 123 Americans will die on the sinking of the Lusitania, and individuals like Theodore Roosevelt as well as the War Party are going to call on Americans to slowly get involved in this conflict. However, Wilson's going to try desperately to keep the U.S. out and demand that Germany make an apology. After future episodes aboard the Sussex as well as the Arabic ships, we will eventually see that Germany would agree to apologize, compensate the families for those who had lost loved ones on these cruise vessels, and by May of 1916, agree to end that policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. And as a result of this, we will see that for the time being, America will stay out of war. However, this wouldn't be the end, because we will see that by the beginning of 1917, after Wilson has won re-election, even though he ran off the slogan, "He kept us out of war," we will see that the German Navy would reinstitute that policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. So in January of 1917, just 2 months after Woodrow Wilson regains the White House after he wins re-election, we'll see that the German High Command is going to reinstitute that policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, to where they would once again begin to target ships that were bound for Great Britain that might have war supplies, which would include civilian vessels. And as a result of this, by the beginning of February of 1917, Wilson understood that eventually the U.S. was going to get into war over this policy. Alongside this, what we'd also see is that the German High Command is going to issue out what's known as the infamous Zimmermann telegram, to where in February of 1917, they would try I want to say half-heartedly, to create an alliance with Mexico, tell Mexico to invade the U.S. so that way they would be distracted. And once Germany had won over in Europe, they would send troops to Mexico and retake those territories that Mexico had lost the previous century to the U.S., i.e. Texas, California, and Arizona. And because of these two things, by the time we get to March of 1917, Americans were calling for war. And at the beginning of April of 1917, America would formally declare war against Germany, effectively entering World War I. However, even though America has declared war against Germany, they're not going to have a significant impact within the conflict for about a year and a half. Because the American economy, the American military, basically everything we see in the U.S., the United States was ill prepared to get involved in this massive conflict. So as just mentioned, America was ill prepared for this conflict, both financially as well as militarily. Now, to understand how the U.S. was ill-prepared for this conflict at the outbreak of the war for the U.S. in April of 1917, let's take a look at first the U.S. military. In the U.S. military, you had about 90,000 or so effective combat soldiers. Now, compare that to the German military at this point, which had over 4 million individuals. The U.S. was ill-prepared militarily for this conflict. Not to mention, they also needed to have a large quantity of supplies, ammunition, weapons, tanks, and so on and so forth. So they were ill-prepared in that aspect. Alongside this, financially, the nation was ill-prepared for the war. Because once again, logistically, they needed to produce all those munitions. But over time, we will see that the U.S. would slowly begin to prepare for the conflict. But they won't have a major impact in the war itself until the summer of 1918. And why is that important? Well, it's because over the course of this roughly year, we will see that the situation in Europe is going to drastically change. Basically, as America enters the war, Russia, one of the Allied powers, is going to leave the war, meaning that millions of German soldiers that were stationed on the Eastern Front could go to the West. And if they could attack the Western Front, attack the French and the British before the Americans arrive, they could win the war. And so we will see that by the March of 1918, this is exactly what the Germans are going to do. They're going to launch their famed spring offensive, and for a moment before the Americans arrive, it looks like the Germans might be able to pull this thing off. However, by June of 1918, we will see the Americans arrive, and I'll talk more about that here in just a second. But in the meantime, as this is all occurring, let's take a look at how the U.S. is going to prepare for this conflict. Now, the first thing is that the U.S. to prepare for this war, obviously, they're going to call for volunteers to join up the army. And we'll see that there would be hundreds of thousands of Americans that would respond to this call. However, there was still a high demand to boost the ranks of the U.S. military, and we'll see that in 1917 and 1918 that the federal government would institute a draft, beginning to conscript or draft into the U.S. military men between typically the ages of 18 to 45. Now, there will be some exemptions, but that would typically be the age range. From there, we would see that also how the U.S. would begin to prepare for war. They would begin to conduct a propaganda campaign to hopefully gain wholehearted support for the war effort, to dehumanize the Germans while also promote American patriotism. And a big thing that the Wilson administration is going to do, which ultimately is going to be a very big stain on his administration, is in order to promote wholehearted support by the American people for the war effort, he's going to limit some American civil liberties during the course of the conflict. And we'll see this through the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, the Espionage and Sedition Acts are going to limit Americans' First Amendment rights. Basically, what they're going to say is that for the duration of the conflict, if you speak out against the war effort, if you were to say anything negatively towards the war effort, you would basically be thrown in jail up to 20 years. And we'll see that the Espionage and Sedition Acts would be used to arrest well over 1,000 individuals who were speaking out against the war effort. Most of these that would be arrested as a part of these acts will actually be rivals of Woodrow Wilson, many of them being suspected socialists. And we'll actually see in many cases that the Espionage and Sedition Acts will be enforced even after the war has come to a conclusion. But they would only be one of the set of acts that would give certain powers to the president. We'll also see on top of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, the U.S. president would have the authority to basically control the U.S. economy, set prices, wages, and so on and so forth. In America's economy, ironically, as he's stomping out socialist discontent with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, will look very socialist in nature during the course of the war. However, I do want to point out these war powers, once the conflict does come to an end, they will evaporate. But anyways, as we see this at the home front, we're also going to see that Woodrow Wilson, as he's supporting these acts to begin to mobilize the U.S. economy, as well as American society, we're also going to see that he's going to begin to formulate what he hopes would form the basis for peace. And in January of 1918, he's going to reveal to the American people basically his peace plan, that of the 14 points. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with each one of the 14 points, but I'm just going to basically highlight what was talked about in them. In January of 1918, Woodrow Wilson was hopeful that the United States would basically pave the world and make it safe for democracy after the conflict. He would call through his 14 points for the breakup of major European empires to create nations that would be elected by the people over in Europe. He would also call for freedom of the seas, a very issue that had gotten America involved in the war. And lastly, as a part of his 14 point, he would call for the creation of a League of Nations to maintain the peace after the conflict. And we'll see at first, most Americans are going to heavily support his 14 points. Some will be against it, but many will support it. But we'll see that that support centered around these issues will begin to change as we go further on in our narrative of the First World War. But for the time being, as he proposes his 14 points, we do start to see that the first large groups of American soldiers will begin to arrive over in Europe. And so let's now turn our attention back to what was occurring on the battlefield. By the beginning of the spring of 1918, we see that the German army had launched their spring offensive. And it looks like that by June, they were about to take Paris. However, in June of 1918, this is where we'll see over 650,000 Americans finally arrive to fight on the Western Front. And here they would stop the German attack into France, and they would begin to turn the tide of the war. With new, fresh troops now from the Americas, we'll see that the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, and the U.S. would go on a counterattack. We'd see that they would take back much of the territory they had lost to the Germans during that spring offensive. And by the time we get to November of 1918, we see that the Allied powers were poised to perhaps enter Germany and lead to its utter defeat. However, on November 11th, 1918, The three powers are going to agree to an armistice to bring about an end to the war. And when this armistice when it is declared, it will bring about the end of the major fighting. But I do want to point out, technically speaking, even though this armistice would be in effect, the war wasn't officially over. The major European powers now had to come to the negotiating table to establish a peace. And in January of 1919, the Allied powers are going to agree to meet at Paris, beginning the Paris Peace Conference that would ultimately create the Treaty of Versailles. So when the Paris Peace Conference convenes in January of 1919, we see that the delegates would be from mainly the big four European powers of Italy, the U.S., Great Britain, and France, are going to agree to several clauses. We'll actually see that Woodrow Wilson would personally attend this. However, he's not going to have a big impact on the peace, because we'll see that both Great Britain and France are going to determine most of the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, and they wanted to ensure that Germany would pay for that conflict. We'd see that a part of the Treaty of Versailles, they would call on Germany to pay for high war reparations, also to take on ultimate guilt of this conflict, stating that they were the reason this had been caused in the first place. And with all these clauses in place, by May of 1919, it would be proposed to the German delegates, who are going to issue their own reprime of this treaty, but nonetheless they're going to be forced to sign it on June 28, 1919. And with the Treaty of Versailles, it would effectively bring about an end to World War I. Now, one thing I do want to talk about the Treaty of Versailles, what it will establish is while it will place blame on Germany and call on them to pay major reparations, we'll also see that the Treaty of Versailles will establish the League of Nations. However, in order for this treaty to be adopted by the U.S., it has to be ratified by Congress. And when Woodrow Wilson arrives back in the U.S. 6 months after spending his time overseas at the Paris Peace Conference, he'll find that the public mood did not favor this treaty. See, Republicans in Congress are going to universally reject the Treaty of Versailles, and we'll see that America won't end the First World War, technically speaking, until 1921, when they finally agreed to 3 separate peace treaties that were not the Treaty of Versailles that would end the war with them, Austro-Hungary, Germany, as well as the Ottoman Empire. And what's also interesting is when the U.S. rejects the Treaty of Versailles, they aren't going to enter the League of Nations. And that will prove very crucial, because with the end of this conflict, with much of the blame falling on Germany, we will eventually see that this will lead us down the road to another even larger conflict that would be caused by radical ideologies. And we'll talk about the rise of Adolf Hitler and several others in the aftermath of World War I, but we'll save that for a future class. But anyways, we'll go ahead and we'll end on that note. And before we wrap up, just like always, make sure that you complete all assignments, go through all lecture videos, as well as any outstanding work from this past week. But if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. But otherwise, I'll see everybody in the next video.